There is a man sitting in a cell in Kuna, Idaho, right now, who spent 2.5 years in courtrooms across the state saying almost nothing, not a single outburst, not a single visible crack, not one word that anyone in those rooms could use against him. He sat through hundreds of hours of legal proceedings with the composure of someone who had rehearsed stillness until it became indistinguishable from confidence. And then, one day after arriving at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, he filed a formal written complaint about his living conditions. The day after that, he filed another one, this time about his food. And within the same week, he filed a third, carefully worded, formally addressed to the deputy warden, about the quality of the fruit on his meal tray. Bryan Kohberger, inmate number 6302-1, sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, had decided that the prison was not meeting his standards. That detail, as small as it sounds, is the thread that unravels everything. Because when you follow it, when you trace it back through the documented behavioral record that exists across 2.5 years of observation by corrections officers, fellow inmates, forensic psychologists, and the investigators who built the case against him, what you find is not the composed, controlled, academically credentialed man the world watched in those courtrooms. What you find is a pattern, documented, consistent, and in many ways more revealing than anything he ever said out loud. This is Case Hunt TV, and if you are watching this for the first time and you want true crime content that is thoroughly researched, carefully sourced, and never driven by speculation, hit subscribe right now and stay with us. Everything in this documentary comes directly from confirmed public records, official Department of Corrections statements, court documents, and verified investigative reporting. Nothing here is guesswork. Everything has a paper trail. Now let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what prison revealed about Bryan Kohberger, you first have to understand who walked through those gates. Bryan Christopher Kohberger grew up in the Pocono Mountains of eastern Pennsylvania in a small community called Albrightsville in Carbon County. He was the youngest child in a working-class family. His father, Michael, was a retired city worker. His mother, Mary Ann, was by all accounts a dedicated and present parent. He had 2 older sisters, Amanda and Melissa. From the outside, there was nothing about that household that would draw attention. But Bryan Kohberger's interior experience of childhood was something entirely different from the exterior picture. As a teenager, he was heavily overweight, socially isolated, and by multiple documented accounts, a consistent target for bullying. People who knew him from those years described someone who had absorbed a deep and persistent sense of worthlessness. This was not secondhand interpretation. He wrote about it himself. In online posts that investigators later recovered, he described himself in his own words as an organic sack of meat with no self-worth. That phrase was not dramatic flair. It was documentation of a state of mind. Then, around the age of 15, something shifted. Within less than 12 months, he lost approximately 130 pounds. Not gradually, not through a slow, sustained lifestyle adjustment. By every account from people who witnessed it, the transformation was obsessive and relentless. Extreme dietary restriction, punishing physical training, kickboxing. The weight came off so quickly that it created medical complications. An eating disorder severe enough to require hospitalization, eventually surgery to remove excess skin. He later referenced this transformation on a job application, describing it as proof of his dedication and his discipline. He framed it as a character statement, and in some narrow technical sense, he was right. It did demonstrate extraordinary willpower, but willpower directed entirely inward, entirely toward the surface, entirely toward rebuilding what others could see, rather than addressing what he carried on the inside. The people around him noticed. Classmates who had known him for years said it felt like watching an entirely different person inhabit the same face. The quiet, withdrawn boy who had been an easy target became someone unrecognizable. Not warmer, not more open. Colder, more controlled, more assertive in a way that made people uncomfortable rather than at ease. He had not healed what was broken. He had rebuilt the exterior and decided that was sufficient. That pattern, that compulsive, driven need to reconstruct his own image in response to internal distress, would repeat itself for the rest of his documented life. In the years that followed high school, Kohberger fell into substance use. First marijuana, then heroin. Friends from that period described someone searching for belonging, for a group that would accept him, for something that quieted whatever it was he could not quiet on his own. The addiction became serious enough that at one point he stole his own sister Melissa's phone and sold it to fund his habit. His family, by Melissa's own account given to the New York Times in 2026, genuinely feared they were going to lose him. He entered treatment. He pulled himself out. And then, for the second documented time in his life, he rebuilt himself from the outside in. This time, the new identity had a name. The academic. The criminologist. The man who understood how dangerous minds worked because he had spent years studying them formally, methodically, from within the structures of higher education. He earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from DeSales University in Center Valley, Pennsylvania. then a master's degree in criminal justice from the same institution. At DeSales, his academic mentor was Dr. Catherine Ramsland, one of the most recognized forensic psychologists in the country, a researcher who had personally interviewed the BTK serial killer Dennis Rader and co-written a book with him about his own crimes. Ramsland taught Kohberger courses on antisocial behavior, on the psychology of serial offenders, on the internal logic of people who commit extreme acts of violence. She sat across from him repeatedly through his undergraduate and graduate years and saw nothing that alarmed her. After his guilty plea in July 2025, she spoke publicly for the first time about her former student. She told a national news network that she now wonders whether her own curriculum had somehow influenced him. She said she wanted to study him, specifically to understand how she had been completely deceived. A woman who had spent her professional career looking directly into the psychology of some of the most documented violent offenders in American history had been in the same room with Bryan Kohberger on multiple occasions and detected nothing. That is not a minor detail. That is a profile. From DeSales, he moved to Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, to pursue a doctoral degree in criminology. His research focused on criminal decision-making, specifically the psychological processes underlying certain categories of premeditated offenses. He was, by academic definition, an expert on how people who plan serious crimes think before, during, and after committing them. He worked as a teaching assistant. He was paid a university salary. His tuition was covered. He had on-campus housing and direct professional access to students. But colleagues at WSU, who later spoke to investigators, described something beneath the academic performance. They described someone who used intelligence as a social instrument, rather than as a genuine mode of connection. Collaborative in appearance. Strategic in reality. Someone who studied the behavior of others and applied that knowledge not to understand people, but to manage them. Digital forensics analysts who examined his phone after his arrest found something consistent with that description. He had taken photographs of himself alone, in private, never shared with anyone, never posted publicly, just for himself. Front angles, side profiles, different expressions, repeated methodically. When investigators asked him what his favorite film was, he answered without hesitation, American Psycho, the film about a man so consumed by his own reflection that the world around him existed only as a backdrop for an identity, constructed entirely from the outside looking in. On the evening of November 12, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students spent their night the way college students do on a Saturday. Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle spent the evening at the Sigma Chi fraternity house on campus. Madison Mogan and Kaylee Gonsalves went downtown to Corner Club and later to the Grub Truck food stand. They were 20 and 21 years old. They were in the middle of ordinary, irreplaceable lives. Ethan was a triplet from Conway, Washington, studying recreation and sport management. People who knew him described someone who made every room warmer simply by walking into it. Xana was from Avondale, Arizona, a marketing major known for her loyalty, her enormous smile, and the kind of friendship that people carry with them for decades. Madison was from Coeur d'Alene, a marketing major who had been best friends with Kaylee since the 6th grade, a bond that had lasted a full decade and showed no sign of ending. Kaylee was from Rathdrum, fierce and funny and protective, someone who had been planning a move to Austin, Texas after graduation to start a new chapter. They returned to their 6-bedroom rental home at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho in the early morning hours of the 13th of November. 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, were also in the house that night on the lower floor. Moscow was a college town of roughly 26,000 people, the kind of place where violent crime was virtually unheard of, the kind of place where the idea that something terrible could happen inside a rental house on a hill near campus felt, until that night, completely impossible. In the early morning hours, between approximately 4 and 4:30 a.m., Bryan Kohberger entered the residence. He was armed with a fixed-blade knife consistent with a K-bar-style weapon. He killed all 4 of them. Madison and Kaylee, on the 3rd floor. Xana and Ethan on the 2nd. Kaylee had defensive wounds. Xana had defensive wounds. Ethan was attacked while in the room. None of them had a reason to know he was coming. At approximately 4:12 a.m., Dylan Mortensen opened her bedroom door and encountered a figure in the hallway. She later described him to investigators as tall, dressed in black, wearing a mask. She said he had bushy eyebrows. He said something to the effect of it being okay. He walked past her and out of the house. She locked her door. She did not call 911. At 11:58 a.m., a call was placed from the residence. When Moscow police officers arrived, all 4 victims were deceased. The community fractured. Students left campus. Parents drove to Moscow to collect their children. A town that had always felt safe discovered it was not. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Moscow's police department had handled before. They were immediately supported by the Idaho State Police and the FBI. But in the early days, the combination of a small-town department, limited public information, and an unidentified killer created something close to panic. Initial statements from Moscow PD suggesting there was no ongoing threat to the community were met with immediate and furious public criticism. Weeks passed. No suspect, no arrest. Online communities exploded with speculation. Amateur investigators circulated theories on Reddit and TikTok. Innocent people were publicly accused, including Kaylee's former boyfriend, Jack DeCoeur, who was cleared early in the investigation, and the surviving roommates, who had experienced something no person should ever have to survive. The pressure on investigators was immense. What they had was a single piece of physical evidence that would prove decisive. Found on the bed next to Madison Mogen's body was a tan leather sheath, consistent with a K-Bar brand fixed-blade knife. Touch DNA was recovered from the button snap of that sheath. The profile did not match any of the victims. It did not match anyone in existing criminal databases. Investigators uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases and began the painstaking process of investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had led to the identification of the Golden State Killer. By tracing partial DNA matches through family trees, investigators identified a genetic link to a specific family. That family was from Pennsylvania. From that family, they narrowed to a specific individual, Bryan Kohberger. To confirm the match, investigators obtained a DNA sample from trash discarded outside the Kohberger family home in Chestnut Hill Township, Monroe County, Pennsylvania. The DNA from Kohberger's father confirmed the familial connection. Investigators then obtained Kohberger's own DNA from trash collected outside the same residence. It matched the DNA from the knife sheath. Simultaneously, investigators were building a second layer of evidence. Cell phone location data showed Kohberger's device traveling from Pullman, Washington, approximately 8 miles from Moscow, toward the King Road address in the early morning hours of the 13th of November. The phone went dark during the attack window and reappeared on the network as it moved back toward Pullman. More troubling still, that same cell data showed Kohberger's phone had been in the vicinity of 1122 King Road on at least 12 prior occasions before the night of the murders. Surveillance footage from the route between Pullman and Moscow captured a white vehicle consistent with Kohberger's registered car, a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra, making that drive in a pattern consistent with the timeline. On December 30th, 2022, 47 days after the murders, Pennsylvania State Police SWAT officers arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in Chestnut Hill Township. He had driven cross-country with his father for the holiday break. He was taken into custody without incident. When investigators searched his white Hyundai Elantra, they found that it had been meticulously cleaned inside and out. The floor mats and seat covers had been removed and discarded. The car had been scrubbed. The arrest sent immediate shockwaves through both the academic community and the general public. A PhD student in criminology, a man whose doctoral research focused on the psychology of premeditated crime. The dissonance between those facts and the nature of the offenses he was accused of committing was almost impossible to process. He waived his extradition hearing in Pennsylvania and was transported to Idaho in January 2023, where he was booked at Latah County Jail in Moscow. He would remain there for the next 2.5 years. Latah County prosecutor Bill Thompson filed charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of felony burglary. Thompson also filed a notice of intent to seek the death penalty. The legal machinery began to move, and Bryan Kohberger, with every intention of managing every variable of what came next, began to perform composure. Over the following 2.5 years, across hundreds of hours of hearings, motions, procedural appearances, and pretrial proceedings, Kohberger said almost nothing. He sat. He listened. He arrived composed. He greeted his attorneys and his parents, who attended virtually every court date, with warmth. He gave the courtrooms nothing. Not a word, not a reaction, not a visible crack. His defense team, led by attorneys Ann Taylor and Jay Logsdon of the Idaho Capital Defense Fund, filed motions to suppress evidence, challenged DNA. Collection methods, requested a change of venue due to the scale of pretrial media coverage, and questioned the reliability of cell phone location data. The trial was moved from Moscow's Latah County to Ada County in Boise. Judge Stephen Hippler was assigned to preside, but while the legal performance was happening in those courtrooms, a different and far less controlled set of observations was being documented inside Latah County Jail. Corrections staff, investigators, and fellow inmates were watching, and what they saw, independently, separately, without coordination, was consistent enough to form a documented pattern. Kohberger washed his hands an extraordinary number of times every single day. Multiple investigators and corrections staff confirmed this observation. Court TV reported that people who observed him at close range said he went through 3 standard-sized bars of soap every single week. His hands were visibly and chronically red from the frequency. He spent between 45 minutes and a full hour in the shower each time he showered. At night, he almost never slept. He paced. He moved. He remained in near constant motion through the hours when the rest of the unit was quiet. Then he would rest during the day. An inmate who was housed in the cell directly adjacent to Kohberger between August and September of 2024 told investigators that Kohberger was the most intelligent person he had encountered inside the jail. And then, almost immediately, he described him as annoying. The reason was behavioral. The sounds through the wall kept him awake. The constant movement, the restlessness, the inability to simply stop through the night hours. That same inmate described a specific incident that stays with you when you hear it. He was watching a sports game on the jailhouse television. He yelled something at the screen, a frustrated comment directed at a player on the field. Kohberger, who was at that moment on a video call with his mother in the adjacent cell, immediately ended the call, walked to the bars, and aggressively demanded to know whether the comment had been directed at him or at his mother. The inmate was reacting to a football player. Kohberger's response was not confused or curious. It was aggressive and immediate, a reaction completely disproportionate to what had actually occurred. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the documented behavioral reports described this type of response as a hallmark of someone with an acutely fragile sense of self, a person who cannot tolerate even the possibility of being disrespected, even accidentally, even by a stranger reacting to a television screen. A separate inmate, interviewed in a different document, told investigators that if he had not been concerned about legal consequences, he would have physically confronted Kohberger. Not because Kohberger had threatened him, but because of what being near him felt like. He said 4 words that investigators specifically noted in their report. His eyes tell a story. These are not easily unsettled people. These are individuals inside a maximum security holding facility who have encountered circumstances that most people will never face. And Bryan Kohberger, the controlled, measured, academically credentialed PhD student, made them deeply uncomfortable. Not through any specific action, through presence alone. Then came July 2nd, 2025. After 2.5 years of silence, after all the motions and hearings and procedural performances, Bryan Kohberger walked into a Boise courtroom wearing a button-down shirt, a tie, and khakis. He greeted his defense team. He smiled at his parents. And when Judge Stephen Hippler began the proceedings, Kohberger answered each question with a single word. Yes, 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 yes. 4 times. Once for each name. It was the first time he had spoken during court proceedings in over 2 years. He pleaded guilty to all 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. In exchange for the plea, the death penalty was removed from the table. He waived his right to appeal, and crucially, he was not required to provide a motive. Prosecutor Bill Thompson deliberately chose not to include that requirement. He stated publicly that he did not believe anything Kohberger said would be truthful. He did not want to give him a platform to construct whatever self-serving narrative he had prepared. Thompson took away the microphone on purpose. Both men walked out of that agreement having received something specific. Thompson received the conviction, the 4 life sentences, and the silence. Kohberger received his life, and he kept his motive entirely private. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, Judge Hippler sentenced him. 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary, plus $270,000 in court-ordered fines. The judge looked directly at him and stated on the record that he could find nothing redeeming about the man standing before him. Kohberger did not blink. He did not react. He was then transported to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho, and placed on JB Block. JB Block is long-term restrictive housing. It is not designed for comfort. It is not designed for rehabilitation or academic engagement or structured social performance. It is designed to contain. The conditions are precise. Single cell. 23 hours inside it every day. 1 hour of outdoor time in a secured concrete enclosure that corrections officers refer to as the cage. When moved anywhere within the facility, whether to shower, to recreation, or to any administrative proceeding, inmates are moved in physical restraints. Showers occur every other day. There is no audience in that cell. No colleagues to impress. No committee to present to. No academic framing that changes the outcome of anything. On July 30th, 2025, 1 single day after being placed on that block, Bryan Kohberger filed his first formal written complaint. The handwritten resident concern form, obtained by the New York Post and News Nation, was addressed formally to the deputy warden. He described the environment on Unit 2 of JB Block as one he wished to transfer from. He referenced what he called verbal threats and harassment. He requested a specific transfer, not simply out of JB Block, but to BB Block, a different and quieter wing of the facility. He was not pleading. He was not asking. He was filing. Asking is what a frightened person does. Filing is what someone does when they believe the system remains obligated to respond to them in an organized and structured way. The very next day, the 31st of July, he filed a second complaint. This one was about food. Kohberger is a documented vegan, confirmed by former classmates and by faculty at Washington State University. One professor described him as someone who ate only one meal a day and maintained strict dietary restrictions. The prison provides vegan meal options. Kohberger's complaint alleged that items had been repeatedly missing from his tray. He wrote on the official grievance form that the nutritional standard was not being upheld. He filed a separate complaint about the quality of the bananas. The instinct when hearing that detail is to dismiss it as trivial, but forensic psychologists who have reviewed his documented behavioral pattern would tell you it is the opposite of trivial. It is a signal. A person in genuine psychological distress inside a maximum security prison does not file a formal written complaint about fruit quality. A person still operating from a position of assumed entitlement does. The complaints kept coming. On August 4th, 2025, 11 days after sentencing, Kohberger slipped a handwritten note to a corrections officer. In it, he reported that a fellow inmate had made threatening statements directed at him through the air vent system in his cell block. He documented what had allegedly been said. He requested that action be taken. The responding corrections officer confirmed in writing that they had personally witnessed vulgar language being directed at Kohberger. However, the officer also documented that they were unable to positively identify who had made the statements. Without confirmed identification, no formal disciplinary action could be taken. Retired homicide detective Chris MacDonald, who was at the time serving as director of the Cold Case Foundation and had a documented source inside the facility, spoke to the Daily Mail about what was actually happening on that block. He described a situation where inmates had organized a deliberate and sustained campaign of psychological pressure directed specifically at Kohberger. They were using the facility's vent system to communicate with his cell at all hours, taking turns, maintaining it through the night and through the day, relentlessly and without pause. The Idaho Department of Corrections issued a public statement in response to Kohberger's documented complaints about this situation. Their position was direct. They stated that incarcerated individuals commonly communicate with each other in prison. That was the entirety of their position. This is prison. This is what prison is. In fewer than 30 days, Kohberger had filed 5 formal written complaints: food quality, transfer requests, meal tray contents, vent harassment, environmental concerns about his housing unit, each written with the same structured, measured, formally framed language, each treated by the institution as documentation, not as a demand requiring immediate resolution, not as a communication from someone whose preferences carried organizational weight, but as paper to be filed and responded to in the same standard process applied to every other inmate in that facility. The man who had studied criminal psychology for years, who understood institutions from the inside, who had spent 2.5 years performing composure in courtrooms across the state, was discovering that there is a category of environment his entire approach had not prepared him for, one where the institution has already made every decision it intends to make about him, and the only thing left to file complaints about is the bananas. On August 12, 2025, 20 days after sentencing, Kohberger was granted a formal housing placement hearing before a 3-member Idaho Department of Corrections committee. He had 2 requests before the committee: a transfer out of JB block and formal reclassification under protective custody. He walked into that room prepared. His presentation was structured and measured. He referenced the ongoing harassment through the vent system. He spoke with the fluency of someone who understood how correctional institutions operate from a policy standpoint. He made his argument sound reasonable, collaborative, and difficult to deny. And then he said something that stopped the room. In the middle of arguing that he needed protection from the harassment he was experiencing, Kohberger calmly acknowledged that the situation would likely resolve on its own once media coverage of his case faded from public attention. He was not expressing fear. He was not appealing for sympathy. He had already analyzed why the inmates were targeting him, assessed the social dynamics at play within the facility, and diagnosed the situation with the detachment of a researcher reviewing field observations. He then told the committee that eventually he wanted to work inside the prison, to be productive, to participate in shared recreation as any other long-term inmate would. He pointed to a specific high-profile fellow resident on his block as a model for how that integration could be structured. The committee was not moved. Both requests were denied. Their documented reasoning was precise. Administrative segregation, they concluded, remains the best course of action for the protection of staff, other residents, and Kohberger himself. He went back to the cell. The door closed on a timer. Nothing changed. But what that hearing actually revealed goes much further than the denied requests. Beneath every carefully constructed sentence he delivered in that room was the same pattern documented by his WSU colleagues, by the inmates at Latah County Jail, and by corrections staff over 2.5 years of documented observation. He still believed the right framing would change the outcome. He still believed institutions respond to performance. Every school he attended responded to it. Every courtroom he sat in responded to it. Every academic department he navigated responded to it. This committee did not, and that, for Bryan Kohberger, was something structurally new. 3 days later, on August 15th, 2025, a video surfaced online. It spread quickly through Reddit threads, then into Facebook true crime communities, then across social media platforms with audiences in the hundreds of thousands. The footage showed a man inside a small prison cell, in prison-issued clothing, doing something that appeared at first viewing to be completely ordinary. He was cleaning his shoes, slowly, methodically, the same motion repeated with a cloth in his hand, unhurried, focused entirely on the repetition, on the rhythm, on the act itself. The Idaho Department of Corrections responded immediately. They confirmed awareness of the footage and announced that an investigation had been launched. By September 2025, they confirmed the video was authentic. By October 2025, investigators had identified the corrections employee responsible for recording and distributing it. That person had already resigned. Idaho State Police reviewed the matter and determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges under Idaho law. No prosecution, just a resignation. The footage remained. But here is what the video actually produced that no one had planned for. It confirmed on recorded footage what had already been documented separately by corrections staff, fellow inmates, and investigators across the preceding 2.5 years. The slow, deliberate, repetitive physical behavior. The self-contained ritual. The same pattern described at Latah County Jail by multiple people who had never compared their accounts, now visible on recorded footage inside Idaho Maximum Security Institution. Clinical psychologists who reviewed the documented behavioral pattern described it as consistent with a compulsive need to create structure and order through physical repetition when the external environment offers almost none. A person manufacturing control in a space where almost no control remains available to them. Forensic psychology literature also addresses a documented relationship between sustained repetitive cleansing behavior and the psychological weight carried by individuals who have committed serious premeditated offenses. This is not speculation. It is studied. It appears in the clinical literature. Whether that framework applies to Kohberger specifically is a determination that belongs to clinical professionals. But the behavior itself was real. The pattern was consistent, and the footage removed any remaining question about that. The Idaho Department of Corrections never intended for that video to exist, but what it gave the public, entirely by accident, was the most unguarded documentation of Bryan Kohberger's internal state that has ever been recorded. Not the composed man in the Boise courtroom, not the structured complaint letters addressed to the deputy warden, not the measured presentation at the Housing Committee hearing, just a man alone in a cell, repeating the same motion, with a cloth, in a space where no audience remains, no committee, no camera he chose to face, no performance he initiated. Just the repetition, just the motion, just the manufactured order in a place where everything else has already been decided. While Kohberger was filing complaints and attending housing hearings inside that facility, something else was being assembled on the outside. In early 2026, author Christopher Whitcomb published a work titled Broken Play. Whitcomb had obtained access to materials that were never presented in any courtroom, largely because there was never a trial. What he found inside those materials raised a question that has quietly followed this case ever since. The central piece of physical evidence connecting Kohberger to the crime scene was the K-bar knife sheath found on the bed next to Madison Mogen's body. DNA recovered from that sheath was tested and matched Kohberger. Prosecutors described it at the plea hearing as the single strongest physical connection between him and the 4 people he admitted to killing. Before the plea was entered, the defense team hired forensic scientist and criminologist Brent Turvey to independently examine the evidence. Turvey examined the sheath's chain of custody documentation, the official record that is supposed to account for every single instance the evidence is handled, moved, or accessed from the moment of collection through any eventual courtroom presentation. What Turvey found, as reported by Whitcomb, was this. The chain of custody documentation for the sheath appeared to have been completed in 2 separate instances, once on the evidence bag itself, and a second time on a sticker that had been affixed to the front of that same bag. The earliest date visible on the original bag included initials attributed to lead detective Brett Payne, dated November 14, 2022, the day following the offense. The sticker version appeared to have been completed at a separate and different point in time. Turvey's stated conclusion was direct. He indicated that if the case had gone to trial, that piece of evidence should have been ruled inadmissible. He stated further that if the DNA from the sheath were excluded, what remained for the prosecution was a white vehicle and cell tower location data, and that in his professional assessment, that would have represented the most significant evidentiary problem the prosecution faced. This requires careful precision. None of this changes what Bryan Kohberger did. On July 2, 2025, he stood in a Boise courtroom and confirmed his guilt on every count. He was asked directly whether he had committed each offense willingly, deliberately, and with premeditation. He said yes 4 times, once for each name. That is on the record. It does not change. What this does mean is something more specific and more uncomfortable. The case that a jury would have seen The evidence that would have been presented, argued, and weighed by 12 people in that courtroom may have been materially weaker than the public was ever told. And Kohberger's defense team knew this before the plea agreement was signed, which returns us to the question that sits beneath everything else about his daily existence inside that prison. Did he take the plea because he had no realistic alternative? Or did he and his legal team assess the evidentiary landscape, calculate the probable outcome of a trial, and determine that 4 life sentences was the more favorable outcome than gambling on what a jury would actually be permitted to see and weigh? The answer, like his motive, will never be spoken aloud. He waived his right to appeal as a condition of the agreement. The chain of custody question will not be litigated. The jury that never convened will never deliberate. The case that might have looked different at trial is sealed inside an agreement that both sides signed and both sides walked away from. On January 7, 2026, while Kohberger remained on JB Block, 4 families walked into a courthouse and filed a civil lawsuit. Not against Kohberger. He has nothing left to give them. The lawsuit was filed against Washington State University, the institution that employed him, paid him a salary, covered his tuition, provided him with on-campus housing, and gave him direct professional access to students, all while receiving documented complaint after documented complaint about his conduct from the people who were closest to the situation. The lawsuit was filed in Skagit County Superior Court and subsequently proceeded in federal court in the Western District of Washington. It was brought by the parents of all 4 victims, Steve Gonsalves, Karen Laramie, Jeffrey Kernuttle, and Stacy Chapin. Their legal complaint alleged that Washington State University received at least 13 formal reports of Kohberger's inappropriate, threatening, and predatory behavior toward female students and staff before November of 2022. 13 documented reports. From the moment he arrived on that campus, students described him blocking exits, standing too close, following women to their vehicles in the parking areas. One graduate student described him to investigators as the type of person she identified immediately as a stalker. Another described being verbally targeted by him and said he carried what she called a built-up fury or rage. A WSU employee created a private internal alert system specifically and solely because of Kohberger. The system worked as follows. If you were alone with him and felt threatened, you sent an email to a designated address with a single subject line. The subject line was 911. A faculty meeting was convened to discuss his behavior. At that meeting, one professor, whose name remains redacted in the available documents, stated on the record, in front of her colleagues, that if WSU granted him a doctoral degree, he would become the professor who in 4 years would be harassing, stalking, and causing serious harm to his own students. She was right about the outcome. She was only wrong about the timeline. It was not 4 years. It was months. WSU's response to the lawsuit denied institutional responsibility. The university argued that the murders were caused by Kohberger alone and not by any failure on the part of the institution. They argued that the families had missed the applicable statute of limitations. They argued that a graduate student committing mass murder was not something a university could reasonably have been expected to foresee. As of April 2026, the lawsuit is actively proceeding through the federal court system. The families have submitted a witness list of 69 individuals. Courts will ultimately determine the legal outcome of that case, but the documented record it has already placed into the public file is not speculative. It is on paper. R13 reports an internal 911 email system, a faculty meeting, a professor's warning that proved accurate in every material respect. And what does all of this add up to? Not a mystery. The mystery was solved on July 2nd, 2025, in a Boise courtroom, when Bryan Kohberger said yes 4 times. The question was never whether he committed those offenses. He confirmed it on the record. The question that remains, the one that the plea agreement sealed, that the waived appeal cannot reopen, that the silent sentencing hearing left untouched, is why, what was the interior logic? What was the architecture of the decision? He is the only person on earth who knows the answer to that question with any precision. And he has made a choice, whether strategic or compulsive or both, to hold it. He gave up the microphone. He gave up the trial. He gave up any public opportunity to frame what happened on his own terms. And every day inside that cell, the same pattern documented across his entire adult life plays out in miniature. The compulsive repetition. The formal complaints addressed to institutional authority. The performance of structure in a space that offers none. The attempt to manufacture control in an environment that has removed every variable he once managed. The shoe cleaning video. The document nobody planned to release. The footage that circulated without authorization and led to a resignation gave the public something no courtroom produced. It showed Bryan Kohberger at the moment the architecture failed. Not the composed man in the tie and khakis. Not the structured grievance writer. Not the measured, reasonable, carefully framed committee presenter. Just a man alone in a small room, repeating the same motion with a cloth, building the only structure left available to him in a place where every other form of structure has already been decided by someone else. That is what prison revealed. Not a monster performing evil. Not a broken man performing regret. A person still performing, still organizing, still building the only thing he has ever truly known how to build, which is an outward surface designed to manage what lies beneath it. The difference now is that the performance has no audience. The surface has nowhere to go. And the 4 people who should be alive today are not. Because in November of 2022, on a hill in Moscow, Idaho, inside a house on King Road, the architecture of what he had constructed finally collided with 4 lives it had no right to touch. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. Madison Mogen was 21 years old. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old. They were not case files. They were not